moment.
No worries.
Okay, so we are live now. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is NYCHA. I work for Housing Court Answers, and today we have a training with Legal Aid Society for Introduction to Public Housing in New York City, or otherwise known as NYCHA. Today we have Lucy Newman and Martha Carriscalo here for this training. Thank you to them. Just to let everybody know, we will be sharing the slides on our website afterwards, so you don't have to take screenshots or anything. Don't worry about that. And we will be taking questions. So you could put it on the chat, and depending, we may be answering throughout the training or afterwards at the end. But feel free to put your questions there, and to write down where you're from, what organization you work with on chat. Feel free to introduce yourself. And again, this is being live streamed for those anybody who came in late. So again, feel free to leave your cameras on, but if you don't want to, just remember it is being live streamed. And now I'm going to hand it over to Lucy Newman and Martha. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks, NYCHA. Hi, everyone. My name is Lucy Newman. I'm an attorney at the Legal Aid Society and have been doing eviction prevention work for the past 20 years here at Legal Aid. And most recently, we've started up a public housing unit, which is myself and my colleague Alex as the attorneys in the unit. And then we have an incredible team of paralegals, a couple of whom are on this call. Ayana is joining and Martha is here in the office with me. Martha, do you want to say a quick hi?
Yes, hi everyone. So I'm happy to be here. As Lucy mentioned, I am part of the public housing unit. I've been so for almost a year now. I did initially start at the Legal Aid Society with the Housing Justice Helpline, where we did do a lot of housing advice and just like all types of housing matters. But very happy to be here. And then we do have a special guest with us today, our colleague, Ayana, if you want to go ahead and say hi.
Sorry, Ayana, I think just have to
no worries. So Ayana and Martha are going to be doing some of the trainings throughout April as well. I know that you've introduced yourselves in the chat. If there are any like top issues that you deal with, for example, I know probably many of you are dealing with arrears questions, repairs, things like that. Feel free to kind of put that in the chat as well. Very happy to be here talking about all things NYCHA. Could talk about it for hours and hours and hours. And I just wanted to do kind of just a brief overview of what we're talking about when we're talking about NYCHA in New York City. I feel so that the next sessions are all going to be talking about specific actual like topics and how to find the policies and procedures around them and how to address them. I was just going to do a basic kind of intro to NYCHA to give some context to what we're talking about and just some background to where you can find information, how many people call NYCHA home, and that kind of thing. And we are always here to answer questions that you may have. We actually have a public housing unit email, which I can, Martha, maybe you could put that in the chat. That's a dedicated email address that people can email us about. We also have a helpline if you want to give that out to any people that come to seek your services. Email if you want a fast response is often good as well. But you can also reach out to myself or Martha or Ayana and any of our team members. But I'm looking at the time and I know that we want to get on. So so what I wanted to start, can you see that, NYCHA? My screen? Okay. So what I wanted to talk about was just generally, I know that if you're joining this and you're doing the work you're doing, you probably all know what we're talking about when we say NYCHA. But just for those of you who may be new to this housing world or public housing generally, I just wanted to give some real kind of intro background to it. So when we talk about the New York City Housing Authority in New York City, you know that we walk around the place referring to it as NYCHA. NYCHA is itself actually a what we call a public housing authority, or otherwise known as a PHA. So sometimes you'll hear people talking about a PHA, and that can be in the context of both public housing and Section 8. NYCHA is actually the oldest public housing authority, PHA, in the nation. And we actually have the first public housing development also that was ever built and funded in the country, and that is First Houses in Manhattan on First and First Streets. In New York City, we have 3 PHAs, which are the public housing authorities that administer federally subsidized housing. NYCHA is the one we're going to talk about today, and then you will also probably have heard of HPD, which is New York City's Housing and Preservation Development agency, and then we have New York State's Housing and Community Renewal, HCR or DHCR. When we talk about public housing in New York City, we're talking about NYCHA. In New York City, all public housing is owned and managed by NYCHA. In many different jurisdictions throughout not only the state, but the country, there might be many, many different PHAs in a jurisdiction, many of whom might have just little amounts of public housing and Section 8 and other programs. But in New York City, all public housing is NYCHA. So if someone says to you, I live in NYCHA, most of the time they're probably referring to public housing. And we'll talk a little bit about how to distinguish between whether someone's living in public housing or Section 8. NYCHA is a funny organization in that I think, personally, I always think of it as being a New York City institution because obviously it's beloved and we're always talking about it in New York City, but it's actually a state-enabled organization. It's created by state law under the public housing law. And I think really for our purposes, what that really means is that in New York City, in the city council actually doesn't have power to legislate over NYCHA. They have oversight capacity, but they can't legislate because it's actually a New York State organization. So along with public housing, NYCHA also administers Section 8. And that could be the Section 8 vouchers that we often see clients have where they're in the private rental market and they're using a Section 8 voucher to help pay the rent. Or most recently, you've probably been hearing about NYCHA's PACT program, which is where they're converting public housing to Section 8. And they're using Section 8 in a project-based form. So they're taking Section 8 and attaching it to individual units, and then it sticks with the unit. It's not actually a voucher that you can move around with, but we'll do a separate training on PACT. But NYCHA internally has 2 very distinct parts to it, one of which is the public housing side and one of which is the Section 8 side, otherwise known as the leased housing side. And they really are quite siloed. But today, again, we're talking about public housing. So I'll just talk very, very quickly for people who are trying to issue spot, which I feel like is a lot of the work that we're doing. If someone comes to you and says, I live in NYCHA, or you're trying to work out what their rent is, and they say, you know, they fill out an annual, and therefore the rent is set based on their income. You might be trying to find out what kind of federally subsidized rental assistance they get. You're going to want to work out whether it's HPD's Section 8, NYCHA Section 8, whether they live in NYCHA public housing, a PACT development. So there's all different ways that you can try and identify that. So for example, for public housing, I tend to ask people, what is the name of the development, right? So every public housing development in New York City has a name. You could also ask them, do you have a management office on site? Public housing developments do, most of them. You could ask them, do they ever have to go to 803 Atlantic or Fordham Plaza or 787 Atlantic? These are places that NYCHA has to deal with both Section 8 and public housing. HPD's, their executive office is at 100 Gold Street, so that's always an easy way to see that somebody is actually getting HPD subsidy and not NYCHA. But there's a host of different questions that one can ask to find out, you know, what you're looking at in terms of the rental subsidy. Here, I just wanted to state, and again, we'll talk about it later in April when we cover the PACT stuff, But until PACT came along, I think it's fair to say that in New York City, we always referred to public housing as public housing. And recently, because of this conversion to Section 8 under PACT, people really have started talking about public housing as being Section 9 to differentiate it from Section 8. And so today we're talking about public housing, which can sometimes also be known as Section 9. And again, that is distinct from Section 8. So public housing, what is it? This again is just some real backgrounds to kind of the formation of it and where we find information. It is established the actual federal program under Section 9 of the US Housing Act as amended. And again, that is where Section 9 is public housing and Section 8 of the Housing Act deals with the Section 8 federal rental assistance program. If you live in New York City and you read the news or you watch the news, one of the things that we know about public housing is that it has been suffering for very many years from a lack of funding. And it's at all different levels of our governments. So it is both federal, the federal government has been starving it of the funds necessary to adequately fund it. And then in New York State and New York City, the city and state similarly walked away from their obligations to fund public housing. And NYCHA most recently estimated that what we call their unmet capital needs or their backlog is now estimated to be about $78 billion, which means that they have repair needs, whether that is internal to the units or to the buildings themselves, such as roofs, elevators, windows, piping, doors, security, things like that. They estimate to be around 78 billion. And that number is climbing daily. I mean, it increased from about 34 billion in the early mid-2010s to now 78 billion. The Section 9, the public housing program, is administered at a federal level through the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, otherwise known as HUD. What happens is every year, HUD gets money from the federal budget. So Congress appropriates money and they give it to HUD, and then HUD internally works out what each program is going to get, and they give a pot of money to public housing Section 9. I want to just mention very briefly, you probably will have seen as well in the news, the Trump administration is not exactly in favor of rental assistance programs, but absolutely despises, I would think it's fair to say, the public housing program. And so we are expecting there to be some changes that the Trump administration will be making to public housing. Last week, the HUD announced that they've signed a MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, with the Federal Department of Homeland Security around data sharing, around immigration. There is also some other talk of some other actions that they might take around tenancies in public housing. And that's its own separate topic, but obviously it's always in the news right now. And public housing has been under starvation funding for many decades, and we expect that to be, definitely the case for the next few years. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about numbers. NYCHA is just such a part of New York City. It is the largest landlord. So in terms of rental units, they estimate that it represents around 6.9% of all rental units in New York City. 156,000 apartments spread throughout the 5 boroughs. That number used to be around 178 until these conversions under the PACT program to Section 8 took them out of the public housing program. But a huge number of apartments throughout the city, housing a huge number of New Yorkers. The numbers, the authorized and the official numbers of how many people live there don't actually accurately reflect the true number of people that call NYCHA home. So the authorized number, and this is as of last year, is 312,000 public housing authorized residents, but we know that number to be much higher. So it's probably more around northwards of 500,000, possibly even 600,000. And The public housing is a home for some of the most low-income families in New York City. The average public housing income for a family of four is $25,000. You'll see that the average monthly rent is $588. The buildings are old. This is obviously contributing to the cost of the repair needs in these buildings. 190 out of 251 developments are 50 years or older. There are many that are 70 years or older. And you'll hear people talk a lot about just the length of the wait lists. And currently, well, this fact sheet that we'll talk a little bit about says there are around 250,000 families on NYCHA's public housing wait list. And people will throw that number around a lot. Some of the thing I'm going to talk about today is just understanding what that means in terms of the wait list and how the wait list works, just to give you some context to what it means if someone says to you, I've applied for public housing, I'm on the wait list, and what that looks like. I wanted to just show you a couple of pieces from NYCHA's fact sheet. So on their website, they do have in the section entitled About, they do have this fact sheet. It basically runs through like a summary of what is NYCHA, and then it gives you some kind of top facts about NYCHA. I thought these were quite interesting. This gives you the breakdown in terms of the number of developments throughout the different boroughs. I know that you are all attending from all different boroughs, but you'll see that in the Bronx, there's 67 developments, in Brooklyn, 64. Manhattan has 79, Queens has 21, including the nation's largest public housing development, which is Queensbridge, and Staten Island has 10. And then you'll see here, this is the list of like the ages of the buildings, and down there, the population by borough. There's also some demographics. NYCHA is what they call a NORC, a naturally occurring retirement community. There is now a quarter of all heads of household are over 62 years of age. NYCHA obviously is having to address the needs of those seniors, or not address the needs of those seniors. That comes with also its own issues. As we know, there's lots of issues around elevators being broken, and things like that. I'm seeing here, development data book. Okay. NYCHA employs a lot of New Yorkers as well, many of whom actually call NYCHA home. There's about 10,000 employees. That used to be around 12,000, but again, as a result of these conversions to Section 8, many of those employees have been transitioned out of their jobs. The fact sheet is pretty interesting if ever you want to have a look at it. I think it's fascinating just to see just the numbers involved and the breakdowns, and it gives you information not just on public housing, but also on Section 8. Many of you might deal very intermittently with public housing residents. Some of you may be dealing with public housing residents all the time, right? So like we have some colleagues who work in the Red Hook Community Justice Center. They are dealing all the time with NYCHA residents. And then you might have some people who come into your single stop or other home-based programs, and you might see one NYCHA resident every month. You might see 10 in a week. But I just wanted to give you some of the top kind of places that I use to find information around NYCHA, or where I can send clients to get information. I'd say number one is the NYCHA Customer Contact Center, CCC. It is basically the 311 for NYCHA residents and also Section 8 tenants. The number is there, the 718 number. I think it's fair to say that there are issues around wait times on that CCC number. So if you call it, oftentimes the wait times are very long. Sometimes you'll get kicked off because there are too many people waiting on those lines. And but that is NYCHA's version of 311. So if you call 311, you'll get put through to the CCC if you say that you want to talk to NYCHA and or about NYCHA. One of the things that we all should be thinking about doing is advocating for additional staffing of that CCC number. They also have, and I put in quotes here, the walk-in centers. NYCHA has 2 physical walk-in centers. One is in the Bronx and one is in Brooklyn. They are called walk-in centers, but you actually cannot walk into them without an appointment. You have to make an appointment unless you are, I believe, disabled or a senior. So we have asked them actually to change the name to not be walk-in center, but that has not happened to date. But those again are in Brooklyn and in Atlantic Avenue and in the Bronx. The self-service portal is something that NYCHA is really urging people to use in public housing. So that is kind of your online account that then when you've registered for it and created a password linked to your account, you should be able to find information around your annual recertification, your household composition. You can request to add people on that, use it to do interim recertifications, repair needs, and things like that. I personally have used it many times to help my clients, and I find it really tricky. I think sometimes it's not fully operational for my clients. They also seem to have a lot of issues with having to reestablish the password and or not remembering it and things like that, typical kind of online accounts. And I don't know if Ayana or Martha have any different experience, but in my experience, when I've tried to help my clients with doing their annual recertifications or interims by uploading things onto that website, I think it's really hard and not always working well. But again, NYCHA is really urging people to use this self-service portal. If you have a client that doesn't actually have access to a computer, what they will say is you can go to one of these walk-in centers, or they have kiosks sometimes at the different property management offices that you can use. But I would really urge you, if you do have a client who's saying they're struggling, to help them and also reach out to us. The other thing is there's this thing called the My NYCHA app, which I believe can be used to do work order requests for repair needs and other things related to your tenancy. Someone put in here FOIL requests. I see here I made many FOIL requests 2 months ago and just got a reply that I needed to make a couple more months. So one of the FOIL request is a means by which you can get access to information from your file if you're a public housing or Section 8 tenant. You can also get other documents. So for example, I would do a FOIL request if I wanted to get copies of some of their procedures and policies and things like that. It is normal, I would say, to get a response that says they need more time to comply. But you should definitely be watching the length of time that they're requesting. And I'm happy to talk about FOILs separately, but just wanted you to know that if you do want to submit a FOIL request, this is the email address to which you send it. And if you are doing it on behalf of somebody else, you really should attach a signed authorization from them. It can be as simple as I blank residing at blank hereby authorize blank to access my public housing file pursuant to a FOIL request. In terms of copies of NYCHA's policies and procedures, they are listed, a summary of them is listed on NYCHA's website. It's called the ACOP, and which is Admissions and Continued Occupancy Plan, and that is up on their website. It basically contains a list of all of their different policies and procedures, but it is not the entire list. So a lot of it is references to other documents, including their management manual, but it's a great place to start in terms of getting information about, pet policies, appliances, rental obligations, and things like that, if you are just, needing to get some basic information. And the other couple of places or things that I wanted you to know about is just if you do want to become more involved, or if you do want to just keep up to date with kind of all things NYCHA, every year they have an annual plan process. They are obligated under federal law to publish an annual plan which lays out the policies and any potential changes or things that public housing authority is planning to do over the next year or 5 years. And NYCHA issues a draft plan. It's typically been in July or August, but the draft plan comes out sometime in early spring. And then they publish that, and then people permitted to submit comments, either written or at a hearing, which is normally held downtown Manhattan. And you can go and speak about your comments to that plan. It is not an interactive public hearing. The NYCHA employees sit on the stage, but they don't respond in real time to any of the public comments. That is done later when they publish the final plan. But if you do want to kind of keep up to speed in any of the things that they're trying to do, that's a good place. City Council also has a public housing committee that regularly holds what we call oversight hearings, which is where they'll pick a topic and then question NYCHA about it, and city council members who are on the committee and otherwise will come and ask questions, and you can go and testify either on behalf of your organization or other clients. And there is actually one coming up, I believe sometime in April, which is to do with security and other issues. There was one a couple of weeks ago around the PAC program. So you can always find information about that on the City Council website. NYCHA also has board meetings. The information about the board meetings and the schedule for that is on their website. It's also it's a good place to go in case you want to see what it is that they're approving. Most of it is contracts that they're seeking to get approval to enter into, but sometimes there's other information about big plans that they have. So, for example, if they're trying to, get approval to do dispositions and things like that, that's where you would see the request for that, and then the board minutes are posted on the website. So this is, I just wanted to show you again, the website is actually in some ways quite good and has some good information that we can use in other places, I think, lacking in information, in particular, access to kind of their policies and procedures. But they have a NYCHA metrics page, and this is a really good page to get kind of up-to-date information, but also if you want to learn about what kind of outages are going on. So, for example, we see a lot of clients who will come to us and say, we haven't had gas in our building for X number of weeks. The elevators were suddenly not working, or we've got no heat and hot water. You can go onto the NYCHA metrics and find real-time information about those outages. And you'll see that if you go to the public housing and then you go and look into kind of heat, hot water, elevators, you can see what are the currently reported, according to NYCHA, the currently reported outages, and whether they're planned or unplanned, and when they expect to be back online. So if you have a client who's coming in saying that this is the case, you can always pull up this page and find that information. Also helpful if someone is bringing in HP action, as again, proof of any of the conditions that exist. One of the things that I recently discovered is this resident handbook, which is basically a summary of some of the kind of top topics that I'd say most NYCHA residents face. It does kind of an overview of different staff and employee positions. It has information about different areas of information. It has repairs and maintenance, building safety, healthy homes, rent transfers, moving out procedures. It's pretty helpful. Again, it's not complete. You would definitely want to refer to other policies and procedures, but it is a pretty good summary of what you're looking at as a resident, and where to get information and results if you're seeking repairs and things like that. So just know that that's on the website as well. I think it's under the section about NYCHA. Also in that list of kind of information, I found this great list of, it's actually kind of a breakdown of households who are living in public housing, but it also has Section 8 participants, and now has been expanded to include NYCHA's RAD and PACT programs. And then it also does a breakdown borough by borough. And you'll see here it says the number of families, their race, the number of people on fixed incomes, number of households receiving public assistance, those with family members headed over 62 years of age, the length of residency, average years in public housing, the number of one-parent families. Pretty interesting information, just in case you really want to take a deep dive into kind of the demographics of people living in public housing or Section 8. I wanted to talk a little bit about how to apply for public housing. I know for us, well, for the work that we do, most of the time people are living in public housing, and just because of the work that we do, a lot of the time they're at risk of losing their housing. But at the same time, even, for example, within legal aid, we have a juvenile rights practice and a criminal defense practice. And there are many people who are reaching out to us with questions around their clients might either have a pending application for public housing, or we might have people in our homeless rights practice who are reaching out to us because they have a client who's now living in shelter and wants to know if public housing is an option for them. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the application process. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the wait list and then the priorities, just so that you have an understanding of what happens if someone comes to you and says, like, well, I applied for, or I got approved for a transfer based on domestic violence. I got approved in March of 2024. When am I going to get an apartment? You can understand like the limits of the information that you can get, and the process that governs how they fill vacancies and transfers and things like that. So applications have to be submitted online. The NYCHA website has a whole space dedicated to the applications. You can also use your NYCHA. You can set up a portal, a self-service portal, and make your application through there. Paper, I mentioned earlier that they really are pushing to make people do things all online. It used to be obviously back in the day that the applications were all done through paper and then submitted to the offices. Now it's all online. But if you need a paper application as a reasonable accommodation or otherwise, then you can call the CCC to get one mailed to you or to your client or a family member, or you can make an appointment, I guess, to go to a walk-in center and then request the form. The form is this 070002. Again, these are the spaces. It's 1 Fordham Plaza in the Bronx or 787 Atlantic Avenue. And that is the mailing address, the Long Island City NYCHA address to which you would send a paper copy of an application. I mentioned earlier that the wait list is currently 250,000 households waiting on the wait list. And we'll talk a little bit in the next couple of slides around what that really looks like then in terms of if someone says to you, I've applied, you know, whether they're going to get an apartment within the next 6 months, year and a half, 4 years, or 40 years. And the key thing really to know about if someone comes to you asking questions around where they're sitting on the wait list or what their priority level is or how long it might be, there is 2 different categories assigned to all applications. And someone may get given what's called a needs-based priority, otherwise known as the N, and then it has another number associated with it, priority, or a working family-based priority, which is the W. And so when someone is asking you questions, you will want to ask them, what is the priority you were listed? And then if they say N0 or N1, you know it's needs-based. And if they say W, you know it's working family. I mentioned here a little bit about the wait times. You may have also read about it, but it used to be, I think it was fair to say, that if someone came to me with an N0 priority, which is the highest priority for access to public housing, which would be, you know, currently homeless in a DHS shelter, Department of Homeless Services, and a host of other priorities, and they had been certified as an N0, then you could probably expect them to get an apartment within a year, probably even 3 to 4 months to a year. I think now what we're seeing is wait times are much, much longer than that. I have a client who's been sitting on a transfer list as a high priority transfer, domestic violence transfer, and she's been on that wait list now for like over 18 months, and she's still a number 166 on the wait list for that priority. So nothing is happening too soon. One of the stats that they have in the NYCHA fact sheet is that, you know, in New York City, we do have a very low vacancy rate amongst rent regulated around apartments. And in New York City, NYCHA public housing, the vacancy level is also similarly low, even lower, and turnover rate is really low. Once people are in public housing, they are not moving out of public housing that quickly. So the availability of vacant apartments for new admissions is really low. So Yeah, you'll see on NYCHA's website, they do actually have a pretty good explanation of the N0 and N1 priorities. So when you make an application, you get to choose 2 boroughs to which you will then be put onto those wait lists for those 2 boroughs. And if you don't list the 2 boroughs, they will put down the borough in which you currently reside, and then they'll pick another borough for you. If you do an application for public housing, you will then receive a letter from NYCHA mailed to whichever address you give them that acknowledges the fact that they've received your application. And they will then say, this is the priority that we've assigned to you based on our very, very initial review of your application. So you would see then, like, dear Miss Newman, you have been given an NX, N7 priority or a W2 priority. They would say what date they'd received my application, which is key later on in the process, give you a case number, and then they'll say, we find you to be initially eligible, meaning that you've said that you've lived, that you've got an income that looks kind of around the right level, and you have a household that you're applying for that looks like they're eligible and those kind of things. But again, it's a very preliminary finding of eligibility. At this stage, there's really only 2 reasons why someone would be found preliminarily ineligible. And that is, if I were to sit here and list like an income of 200,000-300,000 for a family of 1, they're going to say you do not meet the financial eligibility limits, therefore you're not eligible. Or if my 12-year-old kid decides to, after school today, go online and apply for public housing as a sole head of household, and they are 11 or 12 years old, and they state that, they're going to be found ineligible, because you have to be 18 years or older unless you have legal emancipation. Yeah.
So there was just a question quickly about in the news about a few months ago, there were allegedly around 5,000 apartments empty.
Yeah.
How true is this? And like, why are those apartments not being filled? Do you have?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, they are, and this goes to the things that I was talking about how there are now much longer wait times to get into units, and that's because there are this large number of apartments that are not on the market to be rented right now, and also because they're doing a lot of remediation to apartments. So it's kind of twofold. NYCHA has a pipeline of public housing developments that it is awaiting pact conversion. So there will be a few developments right now who are undergoing a pact conversion. It hasn't yet gone through. So they are currently public housing, but in the future, the near future, they intend to convert them to Section 8 under the PACT program. And when a development is being slated for this conversion, it is very common for them to keep some vacancies at those units, because they use those vacancies after the conversion to be able to host families who are having repairs made in those units after the conversion. The whole purpose of those conversions, or one of the driving forces of those conversions, is to make repairs. And so what they'll do is they'll keep units vacant in that development so that they can temporarily relocate a family to those units, make the repairs in their apartment, and then move them back into their apartment. There's also vacancies because one of the things that NYCHA has started doing probably in the past few years is, it used to be that if there was a transfer, which is the highest rate of filling vacant apartments, if there was a transfer, they would simply transfer a family who was eligible into that unit without doing abatement of lead and mold and other repairs needed. And then a few years ago, as a result of one of the scandals that hit NYCHA, which was the one where the US Attorney's Office investigated NYCHA for all of this systemic mismanagement and fraud, and then they put in place a monitor, a federal monitor with oversight. One of the things they started committing to doing was ensuring that before they put a household into a unit, they do the necessary mold and lead abatements. And so that is actually delaying getting units back up and running so they can fill those vacancies. I hope that answers your question. Obviously, one of the things that we were pushing for before City Council is to hurry up and get those units remediated ASAP so that we can get those units back online so that households can either move out of shelter or move out of a dangerous situation in their other public housing apartments. So this is something that we need to continue pushing for. So back to applications. Once you file an application, and this could just become in handy, you never know, someone might say to you like, oh, I've applied for public housing. It's really important that people understand that they have an obligation to update that application. Otherwise, it is deemed dead by the agency. You have to update that application every 2 years. Even if there's no change in your household composition or your address or anything like that, you just need to make sure you go online and click refile that application. You also have to update, right? So like if you have a new household member that would change your apartment size need and that kind of thing, or you've changed your address so that they need to contact you through a different means, you need to make sure that someone is updating that information. For homeless families and for youth who are aging out of foster care, for whom public housing is a very high priority, they're high on the applications list. It's really important to help those applicants with their address changes. So for example, with the youth aging out of foster care, a lot of the time ACS uses their 130 William Street address so that people can get mail there. I know that, for example, Coalition for the Homeless may do that for homeless individuals as well, just so that they have a fixed address to which they can get notices. So you filed an application, or you've got a client that's filed an application, and you've got back that initial acknowledgement letter that says you're initially eligible. After that, they then do a more thorough review of that application. And what they'll do is they'll schedule you for an interview, and then you have to go to this interview and take documentation. So you might have to take birth certificates, social security cards, information that they request. One of the things that they will do at that interview is ask you about any use of controlled substances. And so you might want to counsel an applicant about that. Obviously, marijuana is legal in New York, but federally it is not. So I urge caution around responding to those questions, and we're always here to help answer any questions you may have around that. So if you are then again found eligible, you'll be placed on a wait list, and that wait list is divided into a whole host of different categories that align with the different priorities. And then if you're found ineligible, they will send you a letter saying for the following reasons you are not eligible, and you can then grieve that or appeal that decision within 90 days. And then if you are put on the wait list, you still do, once the apartment becomes available, you still do have to be eligible at the time of admission to that unit. Someone asked, since NYCHA is a federal program, would immigration have access to these applications? That is an interesting question right now. There is, and we'll talk a little bit about immigration eligibility and the information that they request, but yes, there is, HUD does have information relating to someone's, a household members or an individual's immigration to the extent that they give them that information. So public housing is not an entitlement program. That even though you might be eligible, meaning immigration income and criminal background wise, there is not enough money, and it is not an entitlement program. Just because you fulfill those doesn't mean that you get a public housing apartment. There are different criteria for eligibility. They're listed in the federal law. There are some that are mandated, and then there are some that are left up to the discretion of here, NYCHA, the PHA. So we mentioned age. The applicant has to be 18 years of age or older. Then here, this is a very technical definition of family or household members. This is the definition that is given in the federal rules. You have to have an income that is within the income levels for public housing, which I'll deal with in the next slide. And then you also have to meet what NYCHA calls its standards of admission, which is criminal convictions, and then other other use of either alcohol or controlled substances, which again we'll talk about. There is a list of what we call eligible immigration statuses. So you do have to have at least one person in the household who is immigration eligible, and I'll talk a little bit about that. That is something that could change in the next number of, or they may try and change that, and we can talk a little bit about that. So currently the rule is, and this has been the law for over 20 years, if at least one member of the household has eligible immigration status as defined in the law, then that household can get a public housing unit. And so as long as someone has that status, somebody else who doesn't can reside in that household. They just won't receive a subsidy. Right now, eligible immigration status includes US citizens, green card holders, VAWA self-petitioners, and this is not an exhaustive list, but asylees and refugees, and T visa holders, and there is a list that I can send to people if they want it. And the key thing to know is that if you do live in what we call a mixed status household, which is where not every single person is claiming and verifying that they all have eligible immigration status, then the housing authority will prorate the subsidy. So they won't issue a rental subsidy for the individual that is not claiming to have eligible immigration status. And I'm very happy to answer questions. If you ever come across a family who has this mixed immigration status and you want to work out how to calculate their rent, I'm happy to help answer that question. I'd say that for our clients, a lot of the time public housing, if they are in a mixed status immigration household, a lot of the times it's not actually affordable to them because of the fact that the subsidy is prorated. The other thing is income eligibility. Your income cannot be greater than 80% of AMI. That AMI is the area median income, and that is that information is released annually by HUD. This is the list of, I believe this was 2024 AMI for New York City. So it is also done based on a area by area. So you'd see here that for a family of 4, 80% of AMI is 124,000. So as long as the household income is at or below that, then you would be initially eligible for public housing. Criminal background, I'm going to talk about it just as it relates to the applications process. We also see this for people who are trying to succeed to a lease under NYCHA's remaining family member process. But in terms of if you have an applicant, just be wary of the fact that there is a restriction based on certain types of criminal convictions. The federal law actually only has like 3 restrictions that are mandated, barring access to public housing for certain convictions. They are limited, as I mentioned. One is if you are a lifetime registrant on a sex offender registry, then you will not be found eligible. If you have been convicted of manufacturing methamphetamine in a federally subsidized housing unit, you will not be eligible for public housing. Doesn't matter how much time has passed, that conviction means that you are just barred. The federal rules then say that PHA can then have at its discretion a whole bunch of other barriers to entry based on criminal convictions. Some public housing authorities don't add to the federal limited list. NYCHA does. NYCHA says that there are certain criminal convictions that will mean that you are ineligible for a certain period of time after the conviction. For your purposes, NYCHA runs a criminal background check against any applicant or someone that is expected to be a member of the household who is 16 years of age or older. This change was made that is very helpful for our clients, was made in the mid-2000s, which is it used to be that the criminal background check was actually run at the time you applied. So think that I may have got a conviction for a misdemeanor in January of this year, and then I go to apply for public housing now in April, and they would run the criminal background check. Then there's a period of ineligibility for a misdemeanor, 4, 5, or 6 years. I then wouldn't even be eligible to apply for another 4 years for public housing because they initially would find me ineligible once they ran that criminal background check. They changed that. They changed that now to say that we are only going to run a criminal background check at the time an apartment becomes available, which is really helpful for running the clock down on these periods of ineligibility. So remember, I got this conviction in January. I'm going to be waiting because I got given a pretty low priority for an apartment. I wait 6 years for an apartment. They give me the letter saying, oh, an apartment's become available that suits your family size. Yay, the clock has run on my conviction. I passed the criminal background check. So that change was really, really helpful for us. The thing where we do a lot of work around advocating for our clients is when someone's trying to succeed to a lease under the remaining family member program, which we will talk about later in April, where they do actually run the criminal background check when that person is trying to take over the lease. And again, I could be living in public housing with this conviction, a misdemeanor conviction, and it doesn't pose any problem to me because I'm already in public housing. But then say the head of household dies or moves out, and I go downstairs and say, hey, I want to succeed to the lease as a remaining family member. So they'll say, sure, you're over 16. I'm going to run a criminal background check, and bang, my January misdemeanor conviction comes up. And they say, too bad, so sad. We can't give you a lease for another 4 years, even though I've been living there quite happily with this conviction that no one cared about. So we will talk about that at a later date, but that's really the two places where we see the criminal background issues. Yeah.
So I might have missed this, but did you answer the question in the chat about immigration having access to
Yeah,
application?
we talked about that briefly, and I feel bad. It probably wasn't the best response, but I think it's a tricky time to be answering those questions right now. I'm happy to talk about them offline. This is just a more full description of some of the other things that NYCHA calls standards of admission, which is other things that they might look at to say that you don't make a great tenant, and then you can again, appeal if you get denied on those bases. So I mentioned that the ineligibility time runs now when the apartment is available, not at the time that you apply. Good thing is that in the past couple of years, NYCHA created this new thing called the Justice Committee, which if you are found ineligible because of this criminal background at the time that you're applying, meaning the apartment is now available, and they say, hey, Lucy, you got this conviction in January, I can appeal that. And it used to be that it was just an appeal where I then had to put in some documentation to show that I was rehabilitated or some other stuff. And now they're actually going to do kind of a much more individual analysis of whether or not someone should now be considered barred because of this conviction. And it's called this Justice Committee. You can find information about it on their website. That's kind of just starting to get up and running, and we don't have that much information about it now, but just know that it's out there. Okay. These are the periods of ineligibility. You can find them online, but you'll see here that like for A, B, or C felonies, the period of ineligibility is 6 years from the date of the conviction and the sentence. It used to be that it was 6 years from completion of probation or parole, which, as you can imagine, sometimes if someone had a sentence of 4 years, but then probation for another 6 years, that was 10 years rather than just 4. So now it's just to the sentence. Felonies for D and E is 5 years. A Class A misdemeanor is 4 years, and then for B misdemeanors it's 3 years. Just so you know, violations are no longer a barrier to entry, so they don't look at those. And you can see they have a list of all the criminal offences that they will look at. They've got rid of some of them over time. They mainly, I think, try to look at offences involving violence or threat of violence and things like that. But there are others on there that I think are not really don't go to kind of whether or not someone would be a good tenant or a threat to their neighborhood or employees or anything like that. So it's also something that we're always pushing on to try and get them to reduce the number of offences that they're considering when they look at this ineligibility. This is just the appeal process. You can appeal the denial within 30 days. And then I'm just saying, you can then, if you're denied again, you can request an informal hearing. If you ever have questions around a client getting denied, please know that you can reach out to us. Okay, so I wanted to go back to the priorities, just in terms of if someone is saying to you, for example, in housing court, we might have someone who is being sued in a holdover and they say, I don't have a plan here, like I'm not going to be able to keep this apartment, but I applied for public housing. We want to be able to assess, is that a real opportunity for them? Or is this just a pipe dream? Like there's no way that this apartment is going to become readily available to them anytime soon. One of the things that is governing any admission or transfer in public housing, there's a document called the TSAP, and the TSAP stands for Tenant Selection and Assignment Plan. So if you ever want to, if you can't sleep, or maybe if you want to go to sleep, you should read the TSAP. It is quite a dense document, and it's pretty crazy how they control this, admissions process. So say you've got someone who does pass this initial eligibility, they're put on the wait list. You want to get an understanding of like how that wait list is ever going to get filled. What does it mean? So my client in Staten Island, she's waiting for a 2-bedroom. She put down that she wanted to go to Manhattan. She's being told she's number 166 on the wait list for a 2-bedroom apartment in Manhattan. And I'll talk a little bit about how you can make sense of the TSAP. So I mentioned earlier that we have a needs-based and a working-based priority. Or half of all new admissions, not transfers, but admissions, go to working family and half go to needs-based. Working family was a new priority that was introduced in I believe in the Giuliani years, where they said that they wanted to ensure that there was a mix of incomes in public housing. So therefore, they wanted to ensure that that working families with at least one member who has employment income will be getting access to these, rarely available and valuable apartments. We have pushed over time to reduce, well, we would like to get rid of the working family preference, but that didn't work. But we've over time pushed for greater numbers of people to be, for more apartments to be given to those on the needs-based priority, because just they demonstrate a need, meaning someone is homeless or the apartment that they used to live in is uninhabitable, and things like that. And so the numbers were increased for a while, and now we're back to, pretty much a 50-50 split. Here is a list of the different priorities. So I mentioned working family priority and needs-based priorities. And then within that, there's then a list, a drop down of different priorities within those preferences. So you'll see here, I want to talk about needs-based because needs-based is where you've got the more differences, and that's where our clients usually are getting an N needs-based priority. So N0, which is the highest priority for admissions to public housing, includes those who are homeless, residing in a Department of Homeless Services shelter, so a family with minor children, who are referred by DHS to NYCHA pursuant to one of their own MOUs for admission to NYCHA. ACS also has a priority and an MOU and a memorandum of understanding with NYCHA that says if you have youth who are aging out of foster care, we're going to see ACS will make an assessment along with their staff and the youth to see whether they would be a good fit for public housing, and they might get an N0 priority application as well through that priority. You'll see here that HPD, someone that's been displaced by fire, they may get an N0 reference from HPD, HASA, and then Health and Hospital Corporation. I once had a client that was residing in a rehabilitation center on Roosevelt Island, and she got that priority, the N05, and found an apartment pretty quickly, which was a great result for her. N0 is a domestic violence priority. I would say that it used to be that if you had an N1 priority, you were getting apartments pretty quickly. Again, that time period is definitely lengthened now. We really do, if we see people calling us saying they have an N1 priority, they've been approved. We really, mostly for transfers, but if you do have someone, if they are at imminent risk because of the domestic violence, then we urge them to go somewhere safe and not stay in the place they're at, because the wait might be quite long. So if you ever have questions about that, please feel free to reach out to us. But you'll see there's the list of the different needs-based priorities. I would say that if you have a caller or someone that walks in and says, I've been given N8, you might as well tell them that this is never going to happen for them. I think I once saw an individual who'd been on the wait list for upwards of 25 years with this priority. It is the lowest priority that you can get. It says that you basically don't really demonstrate a need for public housing. You don't live in New York City. It's, you know, it's basically the worst priority that you could get or see. Working family, the W0 through W9, working family, you'll see here that they give the highest priority within the working family for those with, now it's working families with children in shelter, and then it goes to those earning with the highest income, 51 to 80% of AMI, and then the lower priority is 31 to 50% of AMI, and then the next is 30%. So they give higher priority to those with higher income. This is the chart of all charts. This is a diagram of how vacancies are filled, transfers and admissions are dealt with in public housing. So anytime there is a vacancy, this is what happens in the computer system about how it works out, who is going to be given the letter saying there may be an apartment available for you, come and talk to us about it. The TSAP, the Tenant Selection and Assignment Policy, is the result of some litigation that legal aid brought against the Housing Authority in, I believe, the 90s. It was a case, the name is Davis. There was a subsequent Davis case, which was to do with discriminatory policing regarding trespass stops in public housing, but this was the initial Davis case. And this is a permanent injunction that basically the case was brought on the grounds that vacancies were being filled on a discriminatory basis. And this computer now puts it into an objective way of filling vacancies. It used to be that they were looking at race in filling them, and this took that out of the playing field. So what it says here is the very top priority for a vacancy is a transfer. So public housing residents can transfer both within their development, but also to other developments throughout NYCHA's portfolio throughout the 5 boroughs. And those have their own list of priorities based on, again, kind of need and otherwise. So a T0A is that you are currently living in an apartment that is uninhabitable. So say I'm in public housing, there's a fire, I can't reside there anymore, I will get given a T0 priority. And then if a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom, which is my family size, becomes available, I will have the highest priority for that. And so you'll see here that transfers are 1, 2, 3, and then the first 3 buckets of row 4. These are all different types of transfers based on being underoccupied, overcrowded, all that kind of thing. And then 4 working family and needs-based are the two buckets for new admissions. And then you'll see there's the drop downs of the priorities within those priorities, and it's done on a rotating basis. It's very, very confusing, but needless to say, like what I'm trying to show or convey to you here is that when we talk about this waiting list, and NYCHA, everyone loves to talk about, oh, there's 250,000 households on NYCHA's waiting list. The waiting list is not going to buy the ticket for the movie and standing in the line, and then the person ahead of you gets their ticket, and then you move up in the line, and next thing you know, you've bought your ticket. This is how vacancies are filled. And so you could have applied 20 years prior to somebody else, but because of your priority and where you are on this different preferences, you won't be near the front of the list at all. And if anyone ever has questions about that, but I would say if you do have someone that comes to you and says, I've applied, I've been given, N1, just know that that's a world in NYCHA's admissions. And if you ever want to look at it, you can find it online. You go to the TSAP, you work out what N1 is, and you say, oh, I don't think you should be N1. You clearly should have been N0, and you can help someone adjust their priority. So it doesn't come up often for us because mainly, again, in our practice, we're usually seeing people who are currently housed, but it may come up for us when we're trying to help someone get a transfer. Or again, if someone said, I have applied for public housing and I'm on the wait list, and you can at least see from that and at least understand what the world is that we're dealing with. I know that that's a lot, and I hope it wasn't too confusing. The other thing that goes into how quickly one might get an apartment or a transfer, or even in a termination case, when they say you need to agree to right size or downsize, is there are federal occupancy standards, and they are different for Section 8 and public housing. But you should just know that there is this thing called occupancy standards. This is NYCHA's public housing occupancy standards. You will see here that normally in NYCHA, we talk about the number of rooms in an apartment. So you'll see that if you see room size 4, that means it's a 2-bedroom, and then there's a bathroom and a kitchen, which makes it 4 rooms. So you want to make sure that if someone's applied, that they're being certified for the right bedroom size. Obviously, they have to update their application so that they are then put on the right apartment size for their family size. But also, if someone's coming to you saying, I got this notice saying I have to downsize because they're saying that I'm under-occupied, this is what those decisions are being based on, which is this occupancy standards. And then you'll see here they describe what constitutes under-occupied and then extremely under-occupied. And if anyone's ever interested, we can do a training as well on right sizing and when this becomes an issue. So for example, someone might be faced with termination of tenancy because they're being told that you have to downsize because you are extremely underoccupied, and then you might want to understand what that means and how to resolve it. But if you just ever hear occupancy standards or underoccupied or overcrowded, this is what someone is talking about. It's this occupancy standards which govern the number of units and the number of bedrooms that you're eligible for. The other place where we see this, and you might see this or hear about this, is in remaining family member claims, where someone says, I tried to get added to the household, but NYCHA wouldn't accept my application because they said that adding me to the household would make it overcrowded. That is something that we hear a lot. So for example, NYCHA might say, you can't be permanently added to the household because doing so would make the apartment overcrowded, and we're not allowed to do that under the federal rules. What we can do is add you temporarily, but that means you won't ever get succession rights to the apartment. But this is where we would see it in those kind of worlds. Okay, so this again is just final parts of applications, which is if everything goes well and they say to you, hey, we've matched you for a 2-bedroom, 2-bath in the borough that you requested, here's an apartment, and you go there and you say, it's in good shape. Yeah, I think it's okay. Like all the repairs have been made. I want to take this apartment. And they say, okay, we're going to quickly run the criminal background check your income one more time. Yay, hopefully you'll get given the keys to that apartment. One of the things you might want to help clients with in that situation is security deposit and first month's rent. Ayana, Martha, you probably know this better, or the current information on it. I think we can apply to public assistance for those checks for security deposit. And just so you know, if you're a transfer, they may ask for you to bump up the security deposit, but when you transfer, they will just transfer the security deposit from one unit to another unit. But when you are a new admission, you are going to have to pay a security deposit, just like with any other apartment. And so hopefully then you get the keys to the apartment and you can start living in your NYCHA apartment. I want to quickly mention before I forget that the key kind of similarities and differences with the Section 8 program, but the key things that make public housing so valuable and so stable for people is that as with Section 8 in public housing, rent is capped at 30% of your adjusted gross income. And that is so significant because it does, if everything runs smoothly, which of course it never does, it does mean that you can weather the storms of the loss of income. So for example, when COVID hit, NYCHA implemented an immediate rent hardship policy, which meant that you could self-certify that you had lost your job and that your income was now zero, and they then would adjust your rent to reflect that loss of income. Did it work perfectly? No. There were lots of applications. They didn't all get processed. But at least then if you can show that that's what happened and you did apply for it, you can be protected if they try and seek that higher income. But the great thing is both Section 8 and public housing is that under the law, your rent is capped at what the feds see as being an affordable rent, which is 30% of your household's income. That obviously is an issue if you have someone that is not paying their portion of the rent in your household. We might see that in non-payment cases, in chronic rent delinquency cases. We might see that that is the reason why someone doesn't want to add a member of their household because they're concerned about whether or not that person will pay and contribute towards rent. But the cap on rent is really, really significant. And same thing with, therefore also having a right to transfer to a larger apartment if your household size changes. Things like this enable families to call NYCHA home for many, many years, as does the ability to pass on those apartments if you have succession rights. Here is a little bit about the laws. You don't need to really pay much attention to them. I mentioned the ACOP, which is a summary of NYCHA's policies and procedures. NYCHA's management manual, so there's an applications manual, which is specifically information around applications, but there's also a management manual, which has many different chapters to do with occupancy, which spells out things like the pet policy and things like that, but it also has a whole chapter on rent setting, and verification, a whole section on the termination of tenancy process, the grievance procedures and things like that. If you really want to get into the nitty-gritty, NYCHA also issues these things called GMs, General Memorandum. You can also, if you want to do a FOIA request for those or review those, or if you ever want to look at them, we can give them to you. That's where they might have like some policies and procedures that they're rolling out that are contained there. There are also a bunch of court decisions and consent decrees that are permanent. So they are actually injunctions that are in place. You don't have to be a lawyer to deal with them. You might not even know that that's what you're dealing with. But Escalera is a case that sets out the kind of procedures for when they want to terminate tenancies and have hearings on that issue. And that is the Escalera consent decree that spells out the procedures around that. And that was a case based on due process. I think it was brought back in the 70s. There is a case, Baez, which you may have read about in the news or heard about, which relates to mold. In NYCHA, there is a mold ombudsperson that you can reach out to if your client has a mold issue and has run up against a stop with getting that fixed. That controls like the how the mold gets remediated and things like that. There is Alameda, which is around right sizing and downsizing, and what your rights are in regards to that and whether you can be mandated to right size. Fields is a case that Legal Services brought relating to interim recertifications and delays in NYCHA processing those and when they can bring a non-payment case if someone has they can't bring one if someone has a pending interim recertification. And then there's a case called Blatch, which relates to guardian ad litems and either the court in a non-payment or a holdover appointing a GAL, or in a termination of tenancy case, if someone is in need of a GAL, they have to be appointed under Blatch. The public housing lease is also a really important document. You can find a form of it online. That spells out, the usual terms of a tenancy, and that contains a lot of the obligations of a tenant, but also NYCHA's obligations. I'm just looking at the time.
We have a good question in the chat.
Yeah.
Can someone have both need-based and working family code?
That's a great question. Yes, you can. You can have both. And whichever one gets you the apartment first will be the one that they pick. So yes, they are not mutually exclusive. That's a great question. This again just goes to how vacancies are filled, which again is tied to the family size, the apartment size, and just because an apartment becomes available doesn't mean that it's like you're eligible for it, because it might not be big enough for you, it might not be in the right borough, things like that. Okay, so once you're in the apartment, these are kind of some of the issues that we see. We are going to talk about them at length through April. The rent is something that we're going to talk about in greater detail later. Unaffordable rents can lead to instability. We want to make sure that doesn't happen. So we'll talk about rent setting. Who can reside in a NYCHA apartment? We obviously see lots in the news about pets and tigers and all the other stuff that some people have in their apartments, but also people and who can be in them and what is a family and who can succeed. We'll talk about that later in April. Community service requirement is just something that I want you to just you don't even need to remember it, but just if you ever one day see someone come to you saying, I've received this notice saying that I owe them X hours of community service. It is a thing. It's a federal law that passed many years ago that NYCHA did everything they could not to enforce, and then they finally had to enforce it. It's really just a terrible, terrible requirement that says if you live in public housing, you have to do a certain number of community service hours. It doesn't apply to Section 8. But just know that it exists. We talked about occupancy standards. Getting repairs made is also something we're going to talk about later on in April. If anyone wants to talk at a later date about termination of tenancies, I'm happy to do a training on that too. Should we talk about rents, or should we do that on another day? What do you want to do, Martha?
I think we could just go briefly through it.
Okay.
We are going to discuss arrears at a later training, so.
Yeah, I'll just give you some top things, which is that, again, I've mentioned that rent is generally based on 30% of your anticipated projected gross income. So they'll look at what your income was last year, and then they say, we expect you, unless you've told us otherwise, to have the same income. That can be a problem if one year you've had a lot of overtime that you then don't get the next year, but you do have the right to file an interim recertification, which will say, I didn't actually end up earning that much money. Please, can you adjust my rent? There are deductions that you can take that are spelled out in the federal rules. Those are for a minor, for a disabled individual, for a senior, for unreimbursed medical expenses. So they do those calculations. I always, if I see a tenant from NYCHA come to speak to me, I always just do a really rough calculation to see if their rent is the correct amount of rent. Obviously, especially if you're seeing someone in a non-payment proceeding, or if they're coming to you with a chronic rent delinquency case, you want to make sure that that rent has been set correctly. If the whole household is receiving public assistance and that is the sole source of income in the household, the rent will be set at what the shelter allowance is for that family size. If there is a mix of incomes, including some public assistance, that is a different calculation. It's kind of complicated. We've got the information on it, and we can send you the calculation if you need it. Sometimes you might hear someone say, I'm paying a flat rent, or I used to pay a flat rent. A flat rent was a federal rule that said, we kind of want to encourage families who are earning more money to stay in public housing. So what we're going to do is we're going to cap their rent to this ceiling rent or a flat rent. And so for some households, that meant actually that what they were paying was lower than 30% of their income towards rent. It was more like 20%. But that has now been kind of phased out as a result of this Omnibus Appropriations Act from 2014. So we don't really see so many of those flat rent issues. Again, you have to recertify on an annual basis, but you can also recertify on an interim basis. And you can file a grievance if you don't think that your rent is correct. I'm going to fly through these just because I want to finish at around 3:30 because I know that people are busy. Who can live in an apartment? Humans, obviously. There's a whole category of who can live them. We'll talk about that when we talk about remaining family members and households. Pets, one cat, one dog, you have to register them. They can't be a certain type of breed. They're supposed to be under 25 pounds. Put your dog on a diet or just hide them. You can have goldfish, budgerigars, snakes, hamsters, whatever your kids want to have. You don't need to register them. You can get a service animal, and that can be in addition to a cat or a dog that you otherwise have. You can also have appliances. So the household can have up to 2 air conditioning units. You can have an additional fridge, freezer, washing machine. You can't have a tumble dryer. And then they charge you a fee for that. And the fee is basically a charge for the additional electricity or water associated with your appliance. For most NYCHA residents, utilities are included. They don't actually have individually metered utilities. And so this reflects a charge for them to get this additional utility. And it is $8 a month. And you will see it in the rent breakdown. So instead of charging someone for the whole year, they decide to break it down per month. So you might have a question where someone comes to you and says, well, I don't understand why I'm paying in December for an AC unit that I'm not using. And it's simply because they're just spreading the cost throughout the whole year. This is the community service requirement. We will talk at a later date about getting repairs made. Again, that is done through calling the CCC or putting in an order through your self-service portal or my NYCHA. We'll talk a little bit about the history of backlogs and how they dealt with that. And we can talk a little bit about grievances. The one thing to note is really that a grievance is the appeal by a tenant or an applicant to something that the housing authority has done or not done that they're obligated to do. And one of the trainings that we're going to do as well is to talk a little bit about PACT, which is NYCHA's. There's a couple of different programs that they're using to try and address the repair needs throughout the portfolio. One is PACT, which is Permanent Affordability Commitment Together. We'll talk about that at a later date. And there's also a new state legislation, well, from 2022, called the Preservation Trust. There has now been about 4 votes where developments have voted to join the trust and to convert to Section 8 and be managed by the trust. We could talk a little bit about that at another date. And the other thing you might see as well is you might see some clients who are saying, they're trying to terminate my lease, they're kicking me out. You might want to ask someone, is it in housing court or is it an administrative hearing at NYCHA? Because that will make a difference about where they go and what they're entitled to and what their defenses are and what kind of policies apply. Non-payment of rent is just like any other tenant in New York City. They can be sued in housing court for non-payment based on the rent that NYCHA has calculated or that they agree is owed. And you can also be sued in a holdover, either because there's been a termination decision in your case, or it could be a licensee holdover because they're saying you don't have a lease because the tenant record died and you're not eligible to succeed, and we can talk about those. You can also be maybe sued in a drug holdover, which is otherwise known as a bawdy house. We don't see, I think, that many of those, but again, you might see clients in these situations. And that's it. I know that's a lot of information, but tell me if you have any questions or anything you want us to address in other trainings. Or if you have, any follow-up questions from what I just rattled off to you. What is a preliminary wait list? Did we answer that already?
Yeah, so we can give everyone maybe like a minute if they want to put in questions. Just to let everybody else know,
Sure.
in case you aren't aware. As Lucy mentioned before, this is a series, so every Wednesday this month we will be having a different topic. So next week we're doing Intro to Rad Pact, then the week after rent arrears, then repairs, and then finally remaining family member. So if you haven't signed up for the series, I'm gonna post the link to where you can register for the NYCHA series and also the other trainings we have. So
Sure.
I
And
just,
someone just asked if there's any way we could do another one on terminations. I'm very happy to do that. And I'm sorry if I ran through stuff today. I just am very conscious of people's time. But yes, absolutely very happy to do that.
yeah, maybe we can set something up.
Mhm.
Definitely. Do And then also just to let people know, if you have tenants or if you are a tenant, we do have not this version of this training, but like trainings for tenants about harassment, non-payment, HP repairs, so general. So that's geared more towards like more basic knowledge. I know this can be a little in depth for like tenants sometimes or if you don't work in the field. So we have that link under the HTP on our website. And just remember, this training along with the slides will be on our website.
And we are available for any questions that you have anytime. So please feel free to reach out to us.
Yeah. Did you just want to repeat the number again, Lucy?
Yeah, well, our helpline number is 212-298-3450. And our email is publichousingunit@legal-aid.org. And Martha, I think, just put it in the chat when you put it. Yeah. So we're always here to help.
Great. I don't see any questions on the live chat on YouTube, and I don't see any questions here. Okay. So if no questions, then that's great. Thank you so much, Lucy, Martha, and Ayana for this training. We really appreciate it. That was a lot of information. And we are excited for the rest of the training. And if you guys have questions, you have, the number for the Legal Aid Society's Public Housing Unit. It's at 212-298-3450 for anybody who's dialing in, and Public Housing Unit at legalaid.org. But also, if you have questions and you don't know where to start, you can reach out to Housing Court Answers at 212-962-4795.
Yeah, and please feel free to reach out to us if you need follow-up answers or questions.
All right, definitely. Thank you, everyone. Have a good
Bye,
day.
everyone. Thank you for joining.